Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I am the Interim Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Today is our first virtual charla of the year, and it is an official DreamWeek event. DreamWeek is an annual citywide event in San Antonio to reflect on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and foster dialogue across communities. Today's talk is somewhat of a continuation of a talk we held in November on 19th century state-sanctioned violence against people of Mexican descent in the US borderlands. That talk can be found on our Facebook page or our YouTube page if you missed it. Today, we'll be hearing from experts on violence facing Mexican Americans and Mexican descent communities in this day and age, and how we can confront this ongoing civil rights challenge and bring an end to this horrific reality. I want to acknowledge how important the Black Lives Matter movement has been to bringing forth a national conversation about racially motivated violence, and I want to state MACRI's solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Tonight we are joined by Charles Kamasaki, who is Senior Cabinet Advisor at UnidosUS. He recently published Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die, about the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. He previously managed UnidosUS's research, policy analysis, and advocacy activity on civil rights, education, economic mobility, housing and community development, immigration, health, and other issues. Thank you for being with us tonight, Charles. Next up, we have Dr. Sylvia Acosta, who is CEO of the YWCA El Paso del Norte region. In 2019, she served as an expert witness in the House Judiciary Committee's subcommittee on immigration and citizenships field hearing in El Paso, Texas, which focused on conditions along the southern border and the violence aimed at immigrant communities. Finally, we have Dr. Roberto Rodriguez, Associate Professor in the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Arizona. He is author of Yorkie, A Warrior Summoned from the Spirit World, Testimonials on Violence, which was published by the University of Arizona Press just in 2019. He's currently working on a database documenting cases of Latinos and police brutality. So now I would like to turn it over to Charles and ask him to tell us about his work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara, and thank you to the Institute. This is such important work and really appropriate timing. As you note, it's not just DreamWeek in San Antonio, but it is, in fact, the week we celebrate Martin Luther King's legacy to the country. It's a week where we've seen a change in administration that some of us thought might not actually happen peacefully. And I think it's an appropriate time to reflect on why violence against not just African Americans, but Latinos continues to occur at such high levels. Tonight, what I'd like to do is maybe cover some of the ground that you did in your last talk, and provide a little bit of a structural overview, maybe a brief summary of the history of violence against people of Mexican descent, and then conclude with some thoughts about what we might be able to do about it. So to begin with an overview, you know, it's what's been remarkable about the Black Lives Matter movement, the protests following the murder of George Floyd, is how it brought this question of systemic racism back into the lexicon. It had always been kind of a minor piece, only discussed in sociology classes or, you know, among the racial justice elite. And now it's more of a topic of conversation. And I think what's so great about your event tonight is it gives us an opportunity to put the Mexican American experience in that framework. So those who have studied this history know a bit that there was a guy named Rodolfo Acuña who wrote a book called Occupied America, really a revelatory book some 50 years ago, that described the experience of Mexican Americans following the Mexican-American War as an occupation. And that was really an extraordinary framing of that experience for people that didn't really have an ability to put that experience in context. Later, sociologists talked about colonialism or internal colonialism. But really, they're both kind of the same thing. They rest on the notion that those who are conquered people, in effect, and are by definition inferior. That in the context of the Mexican-American War, Mexicans who remained in the United States were viewed as inferior by the white people, Anglos, as we say in Texas, right? Who considered themselves superior, and they were treated as such. And because the conquerors also get to write the history, there's very little knowledge and understanding of this phenomenon among most of our fellow Americans. It's never really penetrated the American psyche, which is why this event and events like them are so important. And that's one of the reasons why, although my book is mainly about immigration reform and mainly about actually one bill that passed in 1986, I felt compelled to include a whole chapter of my book really talking about the experience of how Mexican Americans were racialized in the Southwest after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So, with that as an overview, let's talk about state-sanctioned violence against people of Mexican descent, right? The backdrop here is that Mexicans and people of Mexican descent were heavily segregated, right? The schools were segregated, public accommodations. There was enormous levels of employment discrimination. There was even, in fact, something in the valley where I come from in South Texas, there was something called the Mexican wage, which was always going to be 20, 30, 40% lower than the market wage. And it was just assumed that if you were in a job largely held by Mexican Americans, you were going to be paid a lower wage than your Anglo counterparts. This also followed a series of land grabs where literally robber barons coming from the north were able to grab land that had previously been held for generations, going back to the Spanish land grants. And I think it's important for people to understand this wasn't a 19th century phenomenon or early 20th century phenomenon. It was literally up through the 50s and the 60s that many of these conditions existed. One manifestation of this regime of white supremacy was state-sanctioned violence. Just in one period surrounding the Mexican Revolution from 1915 to 1917, scholars have documented that over 5,000 people of Mexican descent were killed by law enforcement, mainly by the Texas Rangers, or often by citizen vigilantes with the knowledge and really implicit or tacit support of the state, almost all without due process, many of whom were lynched by lynch mobs. A second form of violence was the so-called repatriations, which really, let's call it what it was, which was a matter of expulsions from the United States. We would call it today ethnic cleansing that occurred not just once, not just twice, but 4 times from 1921 to 1954. Over that period, several million people of Mexican descent, about 60% of whom were American citizens, were forcibly pushed out of their own country. And then let's talk about the civil rights era of the 1960s and the 1970s, when in part because there was very little scholarship at that time, and because data weren't disaggregated often by by ethnicity. A lot of the deaths of Mexican Americans and other Latinos were actually considered whites by the census, actually up until 1980. But others on this call, Roberto in particular, I think can discuss in some detail the level of state-sanctioned violence against Latinos since then. In response, I suggest we consider three things. First, there is a policy response that needs to occur. And I know one of the things that UnidosUS is going to be pushing for is full inclusion of Latinos in criminal justice reforms that we're very hopeful are likely to be passed soon. Second is a question of visibility. And events like this, to get the word out that it's not just African Americans, but also Latinos who are affected by state-sanctioned violence on a very large scale, is critically important. I think beyond just holding events, strengthening institutions like the Institute that can provide this information to the body politic is important. Education is critically important. So whether that's supporting better textbooks in the K through 12 space, or more support for Latino studies in the academic space that are going to cover these issues, I think is also an important part of our task going forward. And finally, in the visibility area, we had some good news at the very end of 2020, which was Congress finally, after a 25-year battle, passing legislation to authorize a Smithsonian museum dedicated to Latinos. And hopefully that museum, when it is finally built, is going to include work from scholars like Dr. Rodriguez to talk about the history of state-sanctioned violence against Latinos. But finally, I would say, it's super important that we start with events like these because the Latino community itself needs to better understand its own history. I've been, since the George Floyd incidents and the protests that followed, I've been struck by how many people, even at UnidosUS, many of whom come from Latino studies courses, know so little about the history of the Latino community, not just with respect to state-sanctioned violence, but with respect to systemic racism and how it's operated against Latinos for literally over a century. So if we can do those three things, make advances in the policy space, bring more visibility to these issues, and finally, really educate our own community, I think we have a good shot at beginning to reverse what's really been 150 years of whitewashing or eliminating from the history books this vital part of our history. And finally, you were kind enough to mention my book. And for those who are interested in more information about that, you can see it at the book's website. It's charleskamasaki.com. And I thank you again for this opportunity to address your audience, Sara.
Thank you so much. Let me turn it over to Acosta.
Hello, everybody. Buenas noches. It's almost there. So, Charles, I just want to let you know that I have the receipts for everything you've just talked about. My parents, my mother and her and her parents were part of that Repatriation Act. They lived in Oxnard, California, and they were forced out of the United States, my mother being an American citizen, and repatriated back to Mexico. So that's the first receipt I have. Second receipt I have is my father died when he was 83. He came to the United States with cattle rustlers. He became the head of household when he was only 13 years old. And my father, when he was about 80, shared a story with me that I didn't fully understand, because when you talk about us not knowing our history, that's true. And our people don't talk about like the abuses they've endured. And my dad died at 83, and about 80, we had a conversation, and he told me a story about how he had been hung from a tree when he was just 13 years old. I'd never heard that story. I didn't know that story. And as I did more research after his death, I realized that in the time that he came, those were Texas Rangers that had hung him, because he had come with a group of men that were bringing cattle over. Not illegally, they were doing, the way they did was trade cattle back and forth. And so when you talk about knowing our history, it is critically important that we are aware and we talk to our family members, your abuelitos, your abuelitas. We need to collect those stories. We need to tell those stories. We need to know that history, because it is that history that is going to give us the strength to move forward and push legislation or push movements that are going to move the voices of our community forward. So as many of you are aware, in El Paso, on August the 3rd, 2019, a man from Dallas came to my beautiful community of Mexican Americans, Mexican nationals, a community that's one of the safest communities in our country. And he came fueled by anger. And what I don't understand is that's not a short drive. It's like at least 10 to 12 hours. You know, you get in the car, you're upset, you're thinking you hate people, and then you're driving 6 hours. You're like, well, maybe no, and then 8 hours, and then 10 hours. That is how deep the hatred and the anger was for our people, fueled by rhetoric. Rhetoric that caused the death of 23 El Pasoans, 23 innocent lives taken by a white nationalist. And this is not the first time that that happens to our people, as Charles has stated, as you've gone through. And it is something that we need to be fully aware of. There is a campaign, a rhetoric that has been espoused within our country that paints border communities as violent, as dangerous, as overrun, and that is to allow the perpetuation of violence against our communities, against our people. And that is something that we have to be fully aware of. So when people say, oh, it's just words, it's not just words. Oh, well, he was talking about them, not me. No, he was talking about you too, or she was talking about you too, or they were talking about you too, because they don't see you separate from the group. We are all one. They don't know, when I walk somewhere, they don't know if they call everybody Mexican. They don't know if I am Mexican, proud Mexican, Latina, Mexican American from El Paso. But I have friends that are Salvadorians, that are Peruvian, that are Nicaragüenses, Hondureños, and they don't care. The derogatory term is Mexican. I will tell you that I used to work at New Mexico State University, and one of the places I went was Santa Fe. And I remember this clear as day, where I had somebody say to me, they're like, well, what are you? And I said, oh, I'm Mexican American. You know, my parents are from Mexican heritage. And what they said to me was, oh, you don't have to say you're Mexican. You can say you're Spanish because you're educated. You can imagine the fire and the fuel that just like went through my body in that very moment as a proud Mexican American daughter of a bracero in my community, absolutely proud of my heritage. And so we need to think about all of that in context. And the other thing we need to start doing is defining violence, because violence is not just when somebody hits or hurts another person with a physical. There is there's violent language, there's violent intention, and all of those things will manifest themselves as violence. When I testified in front of Congress, and it was actually on the language of hate and language of racism and how that perpetuates violence and how that creates an opportunity for violence. One of the things that was very apparent was that there has been a systematic attempt to minimize, villainize people of color. But over the last few years, it has been people that are brown, that are Mexican. And you've seen that. An FBI report just showed that there was a 21% increase in hate crimes against people of Latino descent. That isn't a coincidence. For the first time ever, there was more violence against Mexican Americans or Latinos than there were against Muslim communities. That is something that we as a people need to be aware of, and we need to speak. We cannot stay silent. Our community, enough, basta. Enough is enough. I feel I haven't gotten over the 23 deaths in my community. I haven't gotten over the language of hate. I haven't gotten over the fact that children were separated from their parents. I haven't gotten over that we have over 500 orphaned children that we were responsible for. I haven't gotten over the fact that women, as late as the 1980s, were having hysterectomies by doctors because doctors decided that they had had enough children without asking them. And these were indigenous and they were Latina women and Black women. I haven't gotten over that. We can't get over that. So I'm very passionate about this. I feel like there's just so much we need to do, but it starts with language, and it starts with knowing our history, and it starts with deciding that we're not over it, and deciding that we are going to make like strides at trying to change the way that we as a people are described in our country. Our country. And that's what we need to be very clear. We are not new to this community or to these people or to these areas. We are the area. We are from this soil. And that deserves respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just noticing in the comments, so many people are appreciative of your passion, and I want to acknowledge that. I want to turn it over to Dr. Rodriguez.
Yes, that was a perfect segue into the work that I do. You know, I was almost killed by police in 1979. And unfortunately, I was even exposed to violence even before that. But precisely because of 79, I took an interest in the subject and began to study it. And I've been studying it ever since. One of the things that I did, as I said, I wonder how far back it goes. So Charles just gave a little bit of history of that. And then, of course, you yourself did too, Sylvia. That is, I kept going back, like, because that was 70s, right? So I said, okay, what about the 60s? What about the 50s? You know, now there was something called Bloody Christmas in LA. That kind of, there was a group called CSO. That's where Chavez and Dolores Huerta got trained. So they were big. If anybody ever seen LA Confidential, the opening scene, that was Bloody Christmas. And then, of course, like the Zoot Suit Riot, Lagoon. You go back a little further, and Charles mentioned the deportation campaigns, etc. But you go back into, you go, all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, that was lynching era, 30s, 20s, all the way to the 1840s. And then you mentioned the land. Anyway, this will take too long, so I'll just make it short. For me, I literally trade, meaning, like, when did people get treated, like Charles alluded to a little while ago, as less inferior or less than human or not human at all? And, we noticed that the three groups, and there's actually four, we mentioned Native, Black, Brown, but also the Asian community had a terrible past. Maybe not so much right now in the same sense, except for the former president. He made China, and yeah, and kind of like what you said, Sylvia. To Americans, everybody's Chinese, right? What does it matter if it's Koreans or Vietnamese, etc.? So there's that history, and he brought it back too. But the point is, that's what I went back to, literally to 1492. All the declarations where people were not considered human. There's legal documents, the Doctrine of Discovery, the papal bulls, etc., etc. And like I said, there was no time when it was better, in a legal sense, Anyway, so that was then, right? So now 70s, 80s, 90s, today. One of the things that I did after George Floyd was killed, I started counting. I've actually been doing it since 2014, the number of people killed. But it was more intense right after George Floyd. And it was an outrageous number for about 4 months. It was about 120 Latinos killed, you know, and they're mostly Mexican. I'm going to probably say more Mexican because it's really mostly Mexican, or a little bit of Central Americans, and it's always in the greater Southwest. I'm talking about like 85, 90% of all the killings. California being number one, Texas being two, Florida, and then New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, all the southwestern states. In any case, so um, what I did initially is just looked at that period from May 24th when he was killed to Dia de los Muertos. So I put together, and that's why I came up with 120 names. But just like I do every year, so when the end of the year happened, I looked at the entire year and went back to January 1. I had already done it, but then see the way the statistics are kept is that they always have a lot of unidentified. But when I went back, they had identified a lot of the unidentified, and they were Lopez, they were Sanchez, etc. Anyway, so the Washington Post lists 156 Latinos killed for the year 2020. I used three databases, killedbypolice.net and Fatal Encounters. Combined the three, and if I had used their methodology, it probably would have been even higher. But what I came out was this 275. Remember, the Washington Post put 156. It was 275. And again, the methodology is always all these unidentifieds. But on top of the unidentified, that's where like the police say, they don't give out the names. But even after they give out the names, then you have the white category, and then you have the unknown category. About 3-4 years ago, I noticed that a lot of Lopez's and Garcias were in the white category. And I was like, wait a minute, how did they get in that category? So I pulled them out of that category. And then I said, I wonder how it's working out in all the other categories. And so I checked the unknown category, and just as many in there. And next thing you know, I was like, wow. So the point being, this year, probably the highest ever that I've counted. Then this is the year of George Floyd, right? This is the year that the nation blew up. And to the credit of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Resistance movement, I don't think we've seen something similar in the Latino or the Mexican community. But we have reason to. If we, you might say, if there was a reason, we have it, because this year, the number of African Americans killed was 226. The average is usually 230. So remember, I went up to 275. The question is, why does nobody know this? Why? And we're only talking about that which law enforcement gives us, so to speak. Because if you were to go, say, maybe even now, like 3 months down the road and go back, a lot of the unidentified will end up being identified. And you know how I was able to find some is like there was a killing, say, in San Gabriel, and it would say unidentified. That's in on the east side of LA, or El Paso, for example, unidentified, or Nogales. And I would say, like, that doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like unidentified. And so I went through newspapers and followed it. And of course, they ended up being Lopez and Garcia, etc. So I hate doing this work, because like I said, I was almost killed. And God, I mean, I know lots of families that are survivors, survivors of family who have family members that were killed. And all these organizations, it's almost like nobody wants to be part of it. Nobody wants to be part of this group, but it's got to be done. And it's kind of like we're always miffed because, like, the media for sure, no, well, the government for sure, that's not even a question. It's like we don't even exist. But then you also have the media, and then you have organizations. And it's still, I remember when it happened to me, that was the late 70s, and people were like, that's the past, that was like the 60s. And I'm like, no, it's happening right now. And I think we still have that in our communities where people think of it as something from the past. Unfortunately, in the book that I wrote, it's called Yorkie. In that one, I started out with an idea, but it ended up being more because part of it has to do with what I lived, 2 trials. I won them, but all the peoples that I counted. But then at the very end, I figured out something that should have been obvious, but it wasn't for me at least. That is, I always knew that most of the killings were against men, law enforcement and men. And then I had always heard about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to hear about missing and murdered indigenous women. And then I started to do a little bit more research and found that that it also applies to African American women. And guess who else? Migrant women. So I thought, well, yeah, but those are two different topics because one is law enforcement, we pay them our tax dollars. These other people, they're like vigilantes or all different peoples, but we're not paying them. So in my mind, I thought, well, it's two different topics. But as I went a little further, I found out that there is a common source and a common denominator, and that's the judicial system. That is, women are not to investigate. So if somebody goes missing, somebody dies, it's like, who investigates? Nobody does. So that means nobody is charged, executions, nobody doing time, etc. And I'm like, that's exactly what happens with law enforcement abuse. That is, you remember not only George Floyd, but think about Michael Brown. Ever since Michael Brown, we probably have at least 1,000 where we have video, and you can see kill, with somebody hands up in the air, being shot in the back, and in court they still lose, you know. So it's almost like what is it that I mean, what's going on here? So for me, I like I said, I want 2 trials, but if somebody asks me, and I'll tell you, I don't believe in the judicial system, zero. I don't at all. What would make me believe in it? Well, maybe at an international level. I believe that the International Criminal Court of Justice is probably the only place where maybe in the future something could happen. Because if you have those videos, and I've seen them, and it turns my stomach to see these killings, and then they still get away with it in the courtroom. But I'm kind of old school from the 60s, 70s that think like, they're all the same. But I do have a hope. Okay, we have a new administration, so maybe there's a little hope there. Okay, so I think we got to give it a chance. Personally, I think there should be a national summit on this topic. Maybe yourselves can be the host, but I think we need this as a national summit, and then perhaps congressional hearings. And if still nothing happens, then perhaps the International Criminal Court. There is one at the UN and one at the OAS. The U.S. is not signatory to the OAS, but I'm thinking if a case is brought, we just leave it on their doorstep. In other words, to prove that they don't pay attention to us. Like Sylvia was saying about the passion, I got a little bit of that too. Yeah, that is. I mean, I'm tired, and I'm telling you, if you meet these families, Oh my God! You know what I did a year ago? What one of my PhD students filmed me, and now I have like a half of my book. So if anybody were to want to know, say, well, look, here's a link, and you can listen to it, because anytime somebody that's been tortured, somebody that's been subjected to any kind, if they have to speak to that trauma in public, never. People usually break down, even if they don't show it. So the point being is these families are out there hurting, because they have to do this over and over and over. It pays attention to them. I was just part of a group yesterday, but I've been part of different groups at different times. But I'm excited about again, this administration. Maybe there's hope, and so maybe partly through this, maybe this to something that happens good in the future.
Roberto, I know you've been compiling a list, and I'm just wondering if you would like to share that. Would you like to?
Yes. Can I share it, or can you share it?
Yes.
Yeah,
Go ahead. I think if you just scroll up on your computer, we can see that.
Are you seeing it scroll?
Not yet.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah. So if you can see on January, Gerardo Antonio Conchas Bustos, Denver, Colorado. So we don't have time to read all of it. You'll be able to see them. And in other words, it's not an abstract thing. We have names, dates, cities. So Lubbock, Texas, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Culver City, LA, Fort Worth, and then here we have Oklahoma. But you'll be able to tell most of them are in the greater Southwest. We have Topeka here. There were 18 killed in January, and then February we have 21. And again, Texas. Well, there's nobody even close to California. It's like killing fields in California. But if there's a second, it's Texas. And so you'll see a lot of Texas, San Antonio, everywhere. And remember, this is just law enforcement. Torrance, Gardena, Clare, Oklahoma, Pueblo, so on and on. That's is it March? Yes, and then the following month it was 27. The next month it was 25 in June. Oh, yeah. This is the first full month after, and here we have 32. That's like one a day. Then 20, then 22, 29. September 14, 28, 23, and then 16. The last person killed was from Miami, and then there was New York, even Massachusetts. Then of course Arizona, same thing. Let's see, and I can make this available to anybody who wants it. You introduced me as doing a database, and we are getting a group together to do this. And I think we've had discussions with different people about institutional support. The data is there and it's ugly, And I think for me, what's the most uncomfortable is that it's everything that I've done is very public. There's no secrets out there, but yet it's in the mainstream media and government, it's as if it was a secret. It seems that way. Yeah. So again, if people need these names, in fact, this document here, I think at the very top where the names begin is the column that I wrote for right now. I think it just came out today or this week in the Progressive Populist.
Okay. Well, we'll have to get that link and we can share it with tonight's viewers.
Okay.
I want to bring up something that I think a lot of you have kind of pointed to, and that's the issue of trust. In order for us to get to a place where we can address this violence in a public way and find solutions together, I feel like we have to do something about trust. Dr. Acosta mentioned the children being held against their will at the border and in these migrant detention centers. I don't know how those kids ever grow up to trust law officials in the U.S. I know, all of the people who are mentioning in the comments things that have happened to them or their children being discriminated against by a law enforcement official. How do we learn to trust those folks who are supposed to be protecting us? And so I guess I would just open that up to you and see what you think. Maybe we start with Charles.
Thank you, Sara. And it's been a little distracting because there's so many interesting comments in the chat as well. Someone used the word impunity, which was in my notes, which I forgot to say, but I think it outlines the point well. I think it's important to step back and understand the law enforcement institutions, including the judicial system. They are a reflection of the larger society. And it's not just institutional issues, and it's not just people who view themselves as white nationalists who are really the problem. It's literally half the country. I think we should understand the magnitude of the problem. And then for Latinos in particular, even many people who view themselves as racial justice advocates themselves don't know the histories and frankly don't know the current realities of what's happening. Second, I think it was great for you to have Dr. Acosta on, because when you talk about state-sanctioned violence and rhetoric, right, I think most people view a single person who went to El Paso and shot and killed 23 people and shot many more, as a single deranged individual. I think it would be more accurate to note that just like those people who just tried to stage an insurrection at the Capitol, that man, and unfortunately not just thousands but probably millions of others, believed they were getting direction from the highest office in the land to target the Latino community. And it's not just in hate rhetoric, but they literally believe the future of the country is at stake. They are used to a system in which they are always going to be in charge, and that changing demographics means that they may lose that place. And I think at least part of our job is to speak to some of those folks and explain to them a society, a multiracial democracy in which everyone is equal, is something in which whites aren't going to lose. They're actually going to gain, as is the entire society. And I don't think we do a very good job of doing that sometimes. I think we have to show disaffected white Americans that they have an interest in a successful multiracial democracy. And finally, there were a number of references made to potential sources. Let me just mention two. Someone was talking about hysterectomies or sterilizations of Latinos, even up until the 60s and 70s. There's a great PBS documentary called No Mas Bebés, that features a very young Antonia Hernandez, who went on to head the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund in one of her first major cases. And the second is a movie that UnidosUS, actually the former National Council of La Raza, had a hand in producing, called The Ballad of Gregorio Cortes, which talks about and shows how the mistranslation of a single word can lead to what later became the largest manhunt in Texas history. So let me just conclude with those two potential resources for your viewers.
Thank
I would just like to add something that I think we haven't addressed, but I think is really important. COVID and the COVID deaths amongst our people. Latinos are 3.3 times more likely to be hospitalized with serious complications with COVID. They're also twice as likely to die. And when people think about people talk about this, they think, well, why is that? Why is that happening? Why? Because our people are the essential workers. Because our people are on the front lines. Because our people are the ones that are making sure this economy keeps going on their backs. But are they also first in line for this COVID vaccine? Really? Are they really first in line for this? And that's something we need to consider. If you look at infant mortality rates, they're 5.1% versus 1.1% of white children. Late pregnancy complications, 7.7% of Latino infants versus 1%. There are inequities and what I'm calling violence in various ways that manifest themselves in different ways. And there is healthcare disparities, and they're all along racial lines. Mental healthcare disparities around racial lines. I remember reading an article about what they call racial fatigue syndrome. And I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but racial fatigue syndrome is something that occurs in people of color. Every time you have an encounter with a person, like your brain only has so much space in it. And when you have an encounter with somebody, you have to think about whether or not that was racially motivated. Like, did they ask me to move my seat because I'm Latina? Did they do that because I was in the wrong place? You have to do that. And what does that do? That creates mental health, like stress. So Latinos and people of color are under more stress constantly because we're having to negotiate how interactions between other people and how those interactions were meant. And so I think when we think about and we talk about violence against our communities, we really need to broaden our definition of violence beyond, what is traditionally held as violence, because all of these things together create an oppressive society and an oppressive movement for our people. And how do we get out of that? Oh my gosh, I think a national summit is a great idea and something we should be pushing for, something Julian or Joaquin or Veronica should be pushing for in our communities to talk about the issues of race and violence, particularly with the increase that we've seen with Latinos in our country over the last 3 years.
If I can add something, Sara.
Yes.
What you just mentioned, Sylvia, and I know Charles alluded to it also, but that's what I refer to as spiritual violence, and that is the violence of not belonging. In other words, in this country, we are not seen as we belong, so therefore either they get rid of us or deport us, etc. So yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is, and it's a heavy toll. Everywhere you turn around, that's what we call breathing while brown, we talk about all the walking, driving, breathing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're down to our last few minutes. So I want to ask all of you, if there were one policy change you could see pushed through in this next 4 years, what would it be? And maybe two.
Well, I will mention one specific one, which is criminal justice reform. It's not likely to be all in one bill. Some of it's going to deal with sentencing. Some of it's going to deal with police violence. Other parts are going to deal with different parts of the law enforcement system. But I think that's critically important in the immediate term. Now, I think in the longer term, you know, going back to what where I ended my talk, I think we have to build stronger, sustainable institutions that are going to provide not only the Latino community, but other Americans the kind of education they need in order to mobilize and take action. So those are the two that I would recommend.
Okay. Sylvia?
I would say we actually have a Texas legislative agenda for YWCA, and our top priority is to provide funding and support for an evidence-based inquiry or formation of a statewide committee or a national committee to reduce health, gender, and racial disparities. So that is our number one priority. We need to figure out what's happening with people of color along various areas to be able to address the disparities that exist and to be able to move our people beyond where they are right now.
Great.
Yeah, I remember what I was saying is I'm very skeptical because of what the work that I've done. So I don't really have a faith in a lot of systems. But I'm thinking if we're talking about this country, I would think that congressional hearings would be in order to travel around the country to prepare for a summit, and then, you know, something comes of it. Because I think part of the problem is people don't even know what's going on. You know, who would in their right mind knows that, again, 275 were killed this past year, you know, very few. So again, so for me, it's not so much the legislation, but the hearings, because with that would be the publicity, you know, around the country, and again, not to mince words, California are literal killing fields, you know, Texas, you know, you know, I like most people, when I started hearing about all this stuff after Michael Brown, I thought everything's east of the Mississippi. No, you know, California, I mean, it's beyond outrageous. And whoever said it, I described it, but they said it, impunity, you know? So the point being is congressional hearings and then a summit. And for me, all of that would be to prepare for a case before the UN International Criminal Court. Because, you know, the lawyers that I've worked with, aside from the families, they say unless you sue the actual chief of police and unless you see officers that stray, that, you know, that kill, unless they're doing time, life in prison, 9 months in prison is not going to cut it. And that's just like maybe 2 people, you know, out of thousands killed, you have less than a handful doing, you know, maybe they got fired from their job and got rehired by the sheriffs, you know.
Robert, I will tell you that another congressional hearing that is absolutely necessary is the children that were separated from their families and have still not been reunited with their parents.
That's part of the
has to take priority. Yeah. That has to take priority.
Absolutely.
We took children. We orphaned children. And my husband and I were talking about this the other day, and we were talking about the fact that this should go to the Hague. I mean, this is like a crime against humanity, what happened to these children.
And if I could just add on the subject of children, right? That was one place where the Trump administration went too far, right? Where even their own supporters were not willing to support a policy that was designed to separate families and then put the kids in cages. One thing that doesn't get very much attention is there are 6 million or so US citizen children in undocumented families. And those are kids who go to bed every night and wake up every day thinking that the next letter or the next phone call or the next knock on their door could be ICE coming to get their parents. And those kids also suffer enormous mental damage, I think, that we're only now beginning to document. And so we have a crisis not just at the border, but in the interior as well.
Yes.
One more thing. I'm sorry. I gotta say this. So the Remain in Mexico program, I will tell you that that has been very, it's been terrible for children, women have been raped, kids have been stolen. There have been serious consequences to these families that have remained in Mexico. So there has to be a complete evaluation of what happened to families, to children during that time that kids were put in cages and families were separated, because the atrocities that occurred with those people that were being held, somebody has to be accountable for that. We can't just say, well, let's move on. We just can't.
But I want to volunteer to follow up on what we've all been talking about, because I think we do need that national summit, because there's probably different aspects that we have to deal with, right? So we don't want to leave anything out or anyone out. And it's high time if the Institute perhaps takes the lead, or, maybe joint with perhaps another group or two or wherever. I think it'd be awesome. So I'm there for this effort if needed.
Well, we're obviously going to have to keep having this conversation offline. So much is to discuss. I want to thank these speakers for tonight. Just wonderful. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge with us. I do just want to say to the audience, if you like tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI and how you can support our vision for a museum and archive dedicated to preserving and disseminating Mexican American civil rights history by visiting our website at somosmacri.org. You can find out more about El Paso del Norte, the YWCA El Paso del Norte on their website, of course, UnidosUS on their website. And Dr. Rodriguez, we shared information in the chat about how to read your new column. And I'm thinking that as soon as you do have that database up live, we'll probably be sharing information about that too, because I think this is something that just not enough people know about. So I just want to thank you for being with us tonight. And before we sign off, I just want to say to everybody, don't forget, COVID-19 has not gone away. Our communities are still overwhelmed by the spread of this deadly virus. Please be safe and wear a mask. As we sign off, I leave you with a quote from Dr. King. Good night.